Welcome to the Flynn Brothers podcast. I'm John.
And I'm Jimmy. Today's big idea. Red Dead Redemption 2 is the greatest Western.
We talk about 2010's Red Dead Redemption and why Rockstar Games stands alone as a video game company.
Later, we discuss our love for 2018's Red Dead Redemption 2 and why it's the king of all the epic Westerns across all forms of media.
Finally, we pitch ideas for a Red Dead Redemption 3.
It's all coming up. But first, here's the Solons.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah. 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 Uh-huh. Oh yeah.
Giddy up, partner. We're talking Red Dead Redemption 2. You know, we said in the intro it is the greatest Western, which I felt was an odd phrase, but I was trying my hardest to avoid saying best Western. Because, you know, we're sort of holding out, I feel like, for a sponsorship. We can't just drop it without, you know, some sort of collaboration with the hotel chain.
Or at least attempting to avoid a lawsuit of some
Right.
means.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to include it, you know, a little commercial for them, you know, if they just, you know, when you show up, you know, the DoubleTree, you show up at the DoubleTree, they got the hot chocolate chip cookie. Why doesn't every hotel do the hot chocolate chip cookie when you show up?
It's true. They got all the ingredients.
Most
They
of
got
them,
an
yeah.
oven.
They got kitchens, they got room service. They're not doing the hot chocolate chip cookie. I don't know.
Yeah.
I have to explore that on a
Would be
future
a little
episode.
bit of a weird. The Flynn Brothers present their Best Western, brought to you by Best Western.
Yeah, it's a little clunky, maybe.
yeah.
It's a little clunky. But back to the point. We love Red Dead Redemption 2, and we're going to talk about it in depth. But our love for Red Dead started with the first one. Well, technically, the first one was called Red Dead Revolver. Came out like 20 years ago. But the first Red Dead Redemption came out in 2010, and it was awesome. We were, I believe, both in high school when we first started playing it. And we didn't play a lot of video games growing up, but eventually our parents kind of relented, and we found ourselves in possession of a Xbox 360.
We were given it for free.
Right.
It was basically someone was giving it away, and our parents throughout our entire upbringing had said no video games, but then somebody came to our door and offered us a free video game console, and our mother, lover of all things thrifty, was like, all right, under these conditions you can get it.
Being handed it, yes, go for it. But yeah, we loved it when we first played it. It's awesome. It kind of was the first, I would say, very artistic cinematic game we ever played. It's from Rockstar Games, who we'll talk about later, and sort of the games they make. But Red Dead 1 takes place in the year 1911, and you are essentially a cowboy in the Old West. It's basically like Grand Theft Auto in the Old West. You get to do pretty much open choice, right? You can ride horses, you can commit robberies, you can do stick-ups, and you have all this freedom, and you are doing this with the character John Marston. John Marston is the main character. How does John Marston sound, would you say?
The government is trying to steal our freedoms.
Yes, John Marston. The first Red Dead, John Marston is insanely libertarian. He's always saying, the government. Like pretty much every line of dialogue, he's screaming about the government. But essentially, John Marston is a man who used to be in a gang that has left this gang, and he's gone straight. He's got this wife, Abigail, this son, Jack, and this old man who lives with him named Uncle. Is it Jack's uncle? Is it his uncle? Is it Abigail's uncle?
It's just Uncle.
He's everyone's uncle, and he's a crazy old man. But he's basically a rancher, and you are hired as John Marston by the Bureau of Investigation, sort of a precursor to the FBI, to hunt down members of your old gang. You know, they basically want you to work as a government hired gun, and obviously this is bringing up some conflict for the very anti-government John Marston.
Yeah, it takes a bad guy to catch bad guys, is
Right.
the thinking of the government. And yeah, so you kind of traipse around the Old West. You're going after sort of a dirty, fat gross man named Bill Williamson. There's sort of this more suave guy named Javier Escuelos down in Mexico, where you make a very grand entrance down this very captivating cliff, essentially.
Yes. The game is steeped in natural splendor. The graphics, even at the time, 15 years ago, were so ahead of its time. And yeah, the nature is so celebrated in Red Dead games. The deserts, the forests, the open vistas. It really, whatever great Western films capture in huge, wide frames, the video games capture as well.
Right, and allows you to explore it in your own way. It's fully rendered 3D. And then, of course, you're going after the leader of the gang, Dutch Vanderlyn, who's this sort of silver-tongued, charismatic leader of men, able to get them to do whatever schemes he wants. Usually criminal in nature, but with this like pseudo we're saving the world, we're making it a better place type of feel to him.
I always remembered when I first, because the gang is called the Vanderlyn gang, named after Dutch. I was always like, Vanderlyn, what kind of ethnicity is that? And I'm like, oh, his first name's Dutch. I suppose it's Dutch. I suppose he's from the Netherlands. But like we were talking about, there's so many cool things you can do in the game. You can go into saloons and get into fist fights. You can gamble and cheat and play poker. You can get into duels. The game has this cool system where you go into, I forget the name of the mode where time slows down. Deadeye, right. And the way you get Deadeye is you can have some cocaine gum or some chewing tobacco. It kind of gives you this extra superpower where if you're in a duel with someone, time slows down and you can draw your gun a lot quicker than they can and shoot them more easily.
Yeah, like snake oil actually works in Red Dead and moonshine as well. But yeah, there's these sort of larger battles or missions where you're helping people fight in the Mexican Civil War, or you're bringing down Bill Williamson who's holed up at this fort. But then there's also just like random strangers who are just like, hey, amigo, help me out. And there's like a cow that's gotten away from him and you got to help him get the cow back. So it's this really kind of small scale, big scale, just however you want to do it. You can follow the game. You can just sort of ride around and explore and stuff will happen to you. And yeah, 2010, I think, marks a point in video games where the capabilities of the technology as well as our sort of cultural thinking about them shifted to the point where we're like, maybe these aren't on the same level of films now, but they're certainly getting there and they're certainly able to accomplish some of the things that they do.
Absolutely. And the open world, the possibilities feel really endless. In addition to the missions, you can do all the side missions like you talked about, and you can choose to kind of be a good guy or a bad guy. You can, if you want to just steal someone's horse and beat the crap out of them, you can do that. Like in Grand Theft Auto, you can beat the crap out of someone and steal their Maserati, right? There's this endlessness, and I think it's why people love video games, is this freedom of, okay, I'm doing these terrible things that I would never do in real life, but I can kind of do them vicariously through this character. Maybe I had a tough day at work, it was really stressful, people were being mean to me. I can go into the Old West and shoot up a saloon and rob everyone and feel like the man.
Yeah, I might be stocking shelves in the back of Target in real life, but in the Old West, I'm the baddest gunslinger around.
In Red Dead 1, the end scene is really spectacular. Basically, you have you've decimated all members of your gang and you're returning to the ranch to live peacefully, but the Bureau of Investigation, who has hired you, decides to double cross you. And there's this brilliant scene where John Marston gets his family out of the house. The house is under siege by the Bureau, and he gets his wife Abigail and son Jack riding off on a horse, and you're basically stuck in this barn, and it's an insanely cinematic scene. It is so brilliant how they put you in the shoes of the character. But John Marston essentially cracks open the barn door, and you see probably 25 members of the Bureau with guns drawn pointed at the barn door. And you, as John Marston, kind of just, take a deep breath and you throw open the barn doors, all the guns drawn on you, and then the game goes into Deadeye, where time is slowed down, and you basically get to pull your gun and mark as many of the Bureau men as you can mark in the given time and shoot down a ton of them. But of course, you go down in a hail of bullets. And I remember, to our point about games being taken more seriously, almost as cinema at this time, that moment just really sticks out to me as much as any great iconic scene from any great iconic movie would stick out to me.
You don't really feel bad for the deaths of video game characters
No.
very often. It's kind of the
Yeah.
first time that I really remember feeling it, and
Yeah.
because you've grown attached to Marston, you're in his skin. You're
Yes.
riding around with him. You know, you spend hours and hours and hours with him, and then for him to die at the end of the game, that he doesn't win.
Yes,
he does.
and-
You do everything you're supposed to do, and he loses.
And part of why you care for him, he's got the wife Abigail, the son Jack, and then in the epilogue of the game, after Marston goes down, the game does a time jump, and you pick up as young Jack, now grown up to be about 20 years of age, and you and Jack play a couple small missions before going to exact revenge on the member of the Bureau who killed your father, John Marston, and it ends in a very cool way where Jack duels the guy and puts him down, and the title card flashes and the credits roll, and just really, really cool. I mean, it's an incredible game, one we haven't played in a very long time, but the Red Dead games are some of our favorites we've ever played, and it's not a perfect game, looking kind of 15 years ago compared to sort of Red Dead 2 and the stuff we'll talk about. There are elements of Red Dead 1 that feel a little reductive, and maybe if they could go back, they would have changed. Like, we talked about how a good deal of the game takes place in Mexico, and there's definitely some like stereotyping with like the Mexican characters. There's a lot of like shooting pistols in the air and just like very like racist accents I don't need to do, but like very, very like reductive characters. And then there's even a character that you are associated with named Irish. His name is just Irish, and he talks like this. I can do it because I'm Irish. I can do the racist offensive voice.
No one's gonna get upset at an Irish
exactly.
accent.
And he's basically like, I can't remember the last three. He's like too boozy to remember anything. And this actually reminds me. We've been watching the NBA playoffs, and you got the Boston Celtics, right? They won the title last year. Then go on. Every time there's a Celtics game, we've gotten rid of the Washington Redskins. We've gotten rid of the Cleveland Indians for good reasons. And yet we still have the Celtics logo, which is a boozed up Irishman leaning drunkily on a shillelagh with one eye half closed. It's like, doesn't it feel like maybe an update could be issued to that logo?
Just so he can see straight. And I say no. I think we
self-hating Irishman
let's
that you
let
are.
the Irish, the fighting Irish, that guy. He's
exactly.
He's a bit of a caricature himself. But hey, the Irish love it.
That's true.
They're all
That's
in Boston.
true.
But to go back to it, I think that they put a lot of thought into the Marston character and the sort of central family, but you don't feel that same level of care and attention given to the diverse characters of the West. Obviously, there's Native Americans in there as well, and I think they play a little fast and loose with maybe some of the implications of the stuff that Marston does,
Right.
and just don't really think through like, how would people of this racial group appreciate or understand or experience this side of the game where they're sort of relegated as these type of side characters. So I think that is perhaps the one mark you can really make against the game in terms of its vision, which is so broad in scope, but just fails to kind of really fully fill in the picture around the main characters.
And Red Dead 2 addresses some of those concerns and corrects them and expands upon them, as we'll get into later. I want to talk really quick before break about Rockstar Games. Anyone who has never played a Rockstar game will just kind of tell you sort of what the company's about and just sort of what we appreciate about them. So Rockstar Games, which made Red Dead 1, Red Dead 2, it made all the Grand Theft Auto games, it's made the Max Payne games, L.A. Noire, which is one of our favorite games as well, where you play a
Noir detective.
Yes, in Los Angeles.
Yeah,
You're a
yeah.
World War II veteran who's working as his way up in the LAPD. And it's really cool. You just work as like a homicide detective, a vice detective. I think you do arson at one point. And it's just a really cool time capsule of that period.
It's sort of a precursor to Red Dead 2 because you're not allowed to just like drive your car as fast as you want and bash into stuff. Like you're
Right.
trying to actually play the game like you're really existing in this world.
Yes,
Like you
yes.
don't want to anger these people. You're looking at clues. You can't just slam your car. You have to drive. Normally you have to
Right.
stop at red lights or you'll get T-boned. So I think that was sort of an interesting, and again, they really love digging into these genre type
Yes.
games where they
Rockstar Games,
draw
yes.
a lot from films. Like
Yes.
the LA Noire video game draws a ton from noir films of the era in the same way that Red Dead does the same, and Max Payne does from action movies.
Absolutely. So yeah, Rockstar Games, if I had to kind of make a film studio comparison, it's sort of like A24 meets Marvel. Like they're very artsy and art house, but they're also big blockbuster games. Like Grand Theft Auto 5 made over $8.5 billion in worldwide revenue since it came out in 2013. And a lot of that was just sales of the game, but also purchases on their online platform, which this is sort of the Rockstar model, is you will make a great game that'll, take 5 to 7 years to make, all hands on deck, and it'll be a huge smash, and people will play it not only once, twice, multiple times, like you would with a great movie. You're not just going to watch a great movie once. If you really love a movie, you'll watch it multiple times, and then they'll have this online platform where you can play with people all over the world, and then that, butters their bread for another decade.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. The model is they build these really, really rich textured worlds that they kind of guide you through in the gameplay with these very interesting missions that are extremely cinematic in nature. And then you go online and it's just like, hey man, whatever you want to do, you can do here.
You're in the sandbox.
Yeah, it's like Francis Ford Coppola turning over the set of The Godfather to you.
Yes,
It's like, make whatever Italian dinner you want.
Right.
Yeah.
LA Noire 2, I think, was one of the early games that did motion capture with the actors and giving the performances. There's a lot of cut scenes that you're watching, and then even as a detective, you have to read into the motion capture and the actors' performances to tell, when you're interrogating witnesses, to tell if they're lying, to see if they're telling the truth. So very, very innovative, and just lots of great cut scenes, and just the story. I think video games get some liberty in terms of the dialogue. There's usually some like pretty hacky dialogue in a lot of video games, even the great ones. But in terms of just like the overall story structure and incorporating missions into the story structure and all the twists and stuff, I mean, a lot of these Rockstar games are as good as any great film.
Frankly, way more complex,
Yes.
too, than any script, which, obviously follows one path, whereas there's multiple paths that are available to you in any video game. And yeah, I think they were also you could give them credit for legitimizing video games as something to star in if you're
Yes.
a relatively major actor.
Yeah.
The main character in LA Noire is played by a pretty major figure in
Yeah,
Mad Men.
there's a lot of actors from Mad Men that are in
Yeah,
LA
that's
Noire,
right,
Yeah, so it's pretty cool. And I think, part of why people nowadays especially like video games as opposed to films is there's this sort of question of active versus passive enjoyment of your entertainment. In traditional watching of movies and TV, it's more passive. You're sitting back, letting the television entertain you. Whereas you're playing a video game, you're more active. You got the controller in your hands, you're controlling the character. And we've talked to people who've said, I like movies, but I really just prefer video games. There's just more to do. There's more hits of dopamine. There's just more to keep you stimulated. And I think film and television, obviously, we love film and television. We write film and television. We still think it has a place. But you do see how younger people especially are a little more tend to prefer video games and the active role you can play in enjoying them versus sort of passively watching a film.
Yeah, and you can decide how long you want your experience to be. Whereas
Yes.
a TV or you can play a video game for 20 minutes, you can play it for 20 hours.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
you can
yes.
do it however you want it and explore however much depth you want. And it is interesting too that what Rockstar does is gives you the feeling of an auteur making something for you, but you are the one exploring it as opposed to it being revealed to you as the auteur sort of wants it to happen. But yeah, I think as a trade-off of that is you're just never going to get the I will say that cut scenes in video games still haven't quite maybe reached the point that the greatest films reach. But I do
yes.
think that the overall effect, particularly in a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, is something that you can say is greater than any one film because it combines so many elements of them, so much longer.
Yes.
I mean, it's like multiple seasons of television.
Right.
And to see that vision all the way through is something that's a titanic achievement.
Want to do a quick brother shout out, the Hauser brothers of Rockstar Games, Dan Hauser and Sam Hauser. So Dan Hauser, I think until the last few years, was the main creative force behind Rockstar Games, wrote all the GTA games, Red Dead games, etc. And then Sam Hauser, his brother, helped write some of the games as well and helped produce. And, you look back at their career and just their body of work and the level of games and stories they were creating, I think you can pretty much stack them up against against any major Hollywood producer, actor, director, whether you want to look at it from a box office perspective or a more critical acclaim perspective. I think they're on par with everyone from, fill in the blank Marvel director to Paul Thomas Anderson, right?
Yeah, there's somewhere in the middle. And I think that it is interesting to think about their legacy. Like, are we going to appreciate these guys more as they get older? And it seems like maybe video games take on this more cinematic nature, or is this the peak of that era? Because most kids these days don't seem to thirst as much for the super immersive, super realistic, very heavily influenced by film video games. They enjoy more of like Fortnite or Minecraft or Roblox, these kind of more easily digestible things, but perhaps when they grow older, that'll be sort of what they like. But you almost wonder, are these guys going to be seen as these like great film titans? Or are they going to be and there's going to be a lot of people who follow in their wake and do something similar to what they've done? Or are they like kind of off on their own in this own little section of acclaim?
All right, we're going to step away for a quick sec. When we come back, we're diving into Red Dead Redemption 2. Stick around. All right, Red Dead Redemption 2. I suppose we should issue a bit of a spoiler warning as we're going to give away essentially the whole plot of Red Dead Redemption 2. I suppose we should have done it earlier, given we gave away the whole plot of Red Dead Redemption 1. However, folks have had 15 and 7 years, respectively, to play these two games. I feel like we're okay to discuss it, aren't we?
Yeah, and I actually feel like spoilers aren't as important in video games for whatever reason. Wow. I don't know. Just going through it, you're sort of crafting the narrative, and doesn't make it like we're actually currently on our third replay of Red Dead Redemption 2, and it doesn't diminish my enjoyment knowing what's coming next.
I guess part of it's the gameplay, right? You're playing the game and doing the missions. That's such a big part of it that the story can sometimes be kind of secondary or more half of it than all
and
of
maybe
it.
you know better what to expect or what to do.
That's true. Very curious theory you presented. Well, our experience with Red Dead Redemption 2, we got to it a little later. We didn't play when it first came out in 2018, as is our wont as men who enjoy a good deal. We waited until it went on sale, and we bought it in 2020, discounted, and right kind of at the start of COVID, where we knew the whole BS about everyone staying in your house for 2 weeks, and we'll get through this. After everyone blew that, went out and got haircuts and went on cruise ships, and we knew we'd be shacked up for 6 months. We bought Red Dead Redemption 2, and it was awesome. It was a perfect escape during that time where people, were kind of scared to go outside, unsure to go outside, and just the natural splendor of the game and all the things you can do out in nature, not just riding horses and sticking up banks, but also just fishing, hunting, all these beautiful things you can do in the open frontier that was the West, we could do from the comfort of our couch and beanbag chair.
Yeah, it's like playing a video game in one of those romantic scenes, those paintings that they do of the West, where the light is slanting beautifully and there's a waterfall, and the Native American characters are rendered tiny to give the whole thing scale. It's just this gorgeous vision of nature, but also this part of the country that I think still exists in our imagination, of being unspoilt and being able to have all of the possibilities before it, we logged it and mined it and farmed it and all that.
And Red Dead 2, it's even more immersive than the first one. It is a prequel, so it takes place in 1899, so just over a decade before the first one, and you see the gang through the eyes of not John Marston, but of the Vanderlyn gang's capable number 2, Arthur Morgan. And Arthur Morgan is very different from John Marston, right? Arthur Morgan, Marston is a little more of a renegade. He's a little more impulsive. He's a little more, I guess they're both libertarian, but Arthur's a little more, got a better head on his shoulders, wouldn't you say, compared to Marston?
Yes, he's smarter.
Yes.
Because he's basically this juvenile delinquent running around, on the edge of getting killed or locked up for the rest of his life, when Dutch, who is this sort of philosopher, that probably the most well-read man around, doesn't make him necessarily brilliant or even moral, but in comparison to the other renegade gangs that Arthur could have fallen into, this is probably the best of them. Dutch basically teaches him how to read at the age of like 13. So Arthur is not exactly the smartest guy, but there is this sort of like inherent intelligence and curiosity about him.
You'd call him street smart, right?
Yeah.
If this were GTA and streets existed, you would call him street smart. and Arthur kind of owes a lot to Dutch, as you said. Dutch is sort of his father figure, and for how manipulative and deceitful Dutch can be, as we'll get into later, there are some good components to his character. He is someone who, in comparison to the other gang leaders and members of other gangs that the Vanderlyn gang goes against, Dutch believes that their gang is a family, and there are marginalized people, there are women and children, and he really believes like the capable members of the gang, the strong take care of the weak, and everyone plays their part, right? It's almost this like beautiful quasi-socialist dream he has.
Yeah, it's basically a tribe where he is the chief.
Yes.
And it keeps them a more civilized, having the women around, it keeps it from just being a bunch of gross dudes scratching around in the dirt. And all of the other gangs are like crazy, weird mountain people or Civil War holdouts of the Confederacy.
Or dirty Irishmen. Yeah.
So in comparison to them, the Vanderlyn gang certainly looks better, but at the same time, they're still doing all of the cool stuff. And I think part of what's good about the Arthur Morgan character is being the number 2 is you're basically just being like, hey, Arthur, let's go rob this stagecoach.
Right.
Hey, Arthur, we're going to go knock up that bank. Hey, Arthur, we're going to go infiltrate this rich family and try to steal some belongings from them. So you're perfectly set up as a video game character because you don't you get to make the decisions when you're in the mission, but people are just throwing stuff at you.
In comparison to film, where you always want a very active protagonist, yes, in video games you want an active protagonist, you're actively doing missions, but you also want essentially a good soldier, someone who's going to take orders from people, right? Which Arthur is the consummate soldier. So you, like you said, you do all the cool stuff that you would do in a Red Dead Redemption game. You rob banks, you rob trains, you get into gunfights with other gangs, you get into duels, you collect debts. But like I said, you also enjoy the natural splendor. You're fishing, you're hunting. Like in Red Dead 1, you're doing these sort of quirky chores for people. A lot of the time, you'll be just riding through a mountain pass and you'll hear, and you'll ride over to a spot on the map and a guy's got his leg in a bear trap. And you help the guy get his leg out of the bear trap, right?
Yeah, or he's on a rock and wolves are trying to get him. Or there's some other gang is sticking up a stagecoach and you rescue them. And so you get this much more complex vision of this world that you've really only gotten a tiny taste of with Red Dead Redemption. The map, they blow it out. So you're no longer just sort of in this kind of little foresty, little bit of desert area. It's probably 4 times larger than the other one. And now you're going into huge snowy mountains and swampy bayous.
But also cities, which at the end of Red Dead 1, you kind of are in nature the whole time in sort of these desert podunk towns, and then you eventually get into this city called Blackwater, which is just sort of a frontier town. Whereas in this game, you're kind of going through these frontier towns, and then you kind of start working your way south. You're essentially fleeing the West. You're fleeing the Pinkertons, which are the precursor to the Bureau of Investigation, precursor to the FBI. Pinkertons are essentially government detectives that are after you. And so at the beginning of the game, you're fleeing from them. You're on the run from the jump. And you eventually end up in this New Orleans style city called Saint Denis, which is really cool to see the contrast of these country folk, these Western folk, and then they come to grips with this giant city. Even though it's a prequel, it almost feels like the game moves a little further in time than the first Red Dead does.
Yes, that there's this more advanced, civilized part of the city. And it is cool, too, to kind of get into like a GTA type environment.
Yes.
It's this very multicultural, very interesting. It's smoky. It's on the water. There's all of these factories around.
Yes.
There's, various evildoers in the town who are wearing fine suits, and you meet like kooky inventors and all of these different people who you wouldn't be able to encounter in the West but existed at this time.
And Arthur is such a great protagonist for this game because he makes advances upon John Marston from the first game in terms of Arthur is a lot more sympathetic to marginalized people. And that's where this game does really well, is there are members of the gang who are like half black, who are Native American, who are women, who are children that Arthur fights for. Whereas in the first game, Marston is mostly just like hanging out with other dudes, taking missions from other dudes, killing other dudes, right? So Arthur is a lot more sympathetic and a lot more almost advanced in terms of how he sees the world. But at the same time, he can be impulsive and brutal and violent, and you just necessarily so have to kill lots and lots of people. And the game has this thing called an honor rating. So when you do good actions, you get good honor, and you move to the right of the meter. And then if you do bad actions, you move to the left of the meter into the red. So good actions, like we said, helping a guy get his leg out of a bear trap, saving a guy from wolves, giving a Civil War veteran who's lost his leg some money, you get good honor for that. And then bad honor, you steal a horse, you loot the dead body of someone you knocked out at a bar. Those are things on how you lose honor. And it's a very interesting, almost like Breaking Bad approach to playing a video game, where it's like, boy, your life is really the sum of your choices.
That, and I think that you have to take responsibility for the things that you do. Whereas GTA has this totally agnostic morality about it. It's just like, yeah, it doesn't matter if you go on a killing spree around the town. It's awesome, actually.
Look, you got 5 stars. Every cop in the city's going after you.
It's like as your bounty goes up. But in this game, you actually start to feel guilt, I would say, when you do something wrong to another person. There's a very distinct sound that happens whenever you do it's like the pang of your conscience. And
I will say this is where we split a bit, because when I play GTA, it's pretty raucous and it's a real shoot 'em up game. And then when you play, you're very gentle and you're trying to do the right thing, and you're mad if you accidentally run over someone with your horse. Whereas I'm like, hey, shouldn't have been under my horse, right? So you and I, we almost are the two sides of Arthur's character as we trade off playing the game.
Yes, we did trade to play off in the game, and a joke that I would make is that Arthur has this almost Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type personality, because I go around, I'm picking mint, I'm helping somebody whose horse has broken down in the middle of the field, and I hand the game over to Jim. He puts on a mask and he's skulking in the night and sneaking into homesteads,
robbing them blind, and anyone who gets in between me and my pistol meets an untimely end. But again, this is just a video game. This isn't real life. That's the beauty of video games. You have a tough day, and then you can go live vicariously through Arthur Morgan.
Yeah, but I would say that the game kind of wants you to be good. Like, I would say it steers you in that way, that you can still be a bad man in the, sort of colloquial sense of the word. You can take out the even worse people than you. You can get your rocks off with killing, but you gotta, there's plenty of bad people to be killed
Do you think part of this evolution, and Rockstar Games has been part of it, because, they've been criticized, particularly the Grand Theft Auto games, about glamorizing violence, and does this make the young children and teenagers who play it more violent, which there's no real statistical evidence to back that up that I've seen. But I wonder if part of it...
Still, I can't imagine it's great to just go to civilians.
8-year-old. I think the younger you are, probably you're a little more impressionable, whereas the older you get, you're able to kind of disconnect the two. But I do wonder if that has been a conscious effort on the part of Rockstar Games to sort of be like, hey, you can still do all these great things, but we're going to push you to be a more moralistic person, as opposed to a guy who's just like, like you said, just shooting random people with impunity.
Yeah, great in quotation marks. I think that it does. I think they maybe even feel borderline guilty, in this sort of way. And it's like, even if you don't think it has this negative connotation, I think as we were playing it during COVID, there was this sort of unseemly feel to it when you do wicked deeds to undeserving people. You're just like, oh, God, is this how I really want to spend my time? Like, especially when you live, especially as we did in COVID, you're living vicariously through this character
Right.
because you yourself in your reality is trapped in your apartment. You're
Right.
not allowed to go outside. You're not allowed to have a lot of freedom. And then you have complete freedom with this character in this very realistic world. And you're like, wow, what am I going to do with this freedom? How am I going to make choices out here?
I was luckily able to suppress that. All right, I want to play a little sub game. This won't be our final game, but a little game in here where we go through members of the gang, and I want you to go and kind of give me your little one sentence or just brief, pithy description of these various gang members. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
Let's start with the name basis of the Vanderlyn gang, Dutch Vanderlyn. We've talked about him a little bit, but sum up for the audience who Dutch Vanderlyn is. Really quickly, I'll just say physically, he's got kind of a shiny red vest and a goatee, just so people get a picture of what Dutch Vanderlyn looks like. Go for it.
He's alternating between being inspiring and idealistic and completely full of it and himself. He's a dreamer, but he's also losing his fastball a
Okay.
bit. He had some more moves in the day.
And the vocal performance is so brilliant because the guy who does Dutch almost does this like cracked voice kind of approach to it, Arthur. And it's really like you say, it is, you see why he's so charismatic and people kind of, the members of the gang fall under his spell. But at the same time, there's this like, okay, something is off with this dude.
Something's breaking. Yeah, I mean, it's not quite as fully pronounced as you did it, but there are tons of that part. And it's almost like you can feel Dutch's emotion that even if he is lying, he believes his own lie.
Absolutely. All right, talk about another member of the gang, Hosea.
Hosea is the old dog. He was probably in charge of the gang when he was younger, and maybe Dutch was his number 2 and Arthur was number 3, but he's gotten older, he's gotten creakier, he's lost the love of his life. He's still good for scheming, but he's not the first guy you take with you into the gunfight.
It's sort of like at the beginning of the Beatles, John Lennon was in charge, and then kind of by the end, John Lennon had taken a step back, and it was more Paul McCartney in charge. That's the Hosea Dutch relationship, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, sure. Pretty good.
Equal number of cigarettes consumed by all parties involved. Okay, the next character is Micah. He's sort of Arthur's foil, would you say?
Yeah, he's the totally unguarded snake. He's
Yes.
just evil, really. He's not somebody who is looking out for the best interests of the marginalized or more helpless members of the gang. He's somebody who's like, let's cut the fat, is what he's always saying.
He makes racially insensitive comments, makes crude passes at the women in the gang. Yeah.
He's trying to split it up. He's trying to change the nature of the game and basically turn them into just a classic gang of outlaw gunslingers.
And he's a newcomer too, so when you pick up in the game, Mike has only been with the gang like a couple months, but he's quickly becoming Dutch's favorite due to his utter shamelessness and willingness to commit heinous acts that Arthur won't commit. So him and Arthur very much kind of opposing characters.
Yeah, he's much more intelligent and manipulative, where Arthur is a pretty sincere, straightforward fella.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about Bill Williamson, or as John Marston would say, Bill Williamson. But Bill Williamson in Red Dead 1 is a little different than he is here in Red Dead 2, but pretty much the same. He's a bit of a one-note character, more or less, right?
Yeah, he's just a hammer. He's muscle.
Yeah.
He's a big fat guy. He rides the biggest horse. He's gross. He's balding, and he used to work for the U.S. Army hunting down Native Americans.
The women in the old West towns, working in the brothels, when they see Bill Williamson come through the door, they're not exactly ecstatic, is what you're saying.
they're not.
All right, and then there's a great character, one of Arthur's close friends in the gang, Lenny. Tell the audience who Lenny is.
Lenny is the son of formerly enslaved people, sort of a young hotshot, kind of the guy who Arthur wishes would be in the Micah role in the
Yes.
gang. Dutch doesn't give him enough credit. And he's just capable, he's cool, he's slick. And I think one of the other things that Red Dead does in a really interesting way is there's this camp set up. Every time you complete a mission, you return to the camp where everyone is set up, and that moves throughout the game as you're basically being chased. But something that'll happen is when you come back to the camp, you'll find these other characters are in dialogue with each
Yes,
other.
yes.
And there are occasionally you're just walking by and Lenny is telling the other members of the gang what it was like when his dad was enslaved.
Yes,
And like
yes.
the brutal treatment that he endured. And you're just like, you get these really like cold splashes in the face of reality from a video game, you know?
Yeah, the depth of detail is incredible in these camp scenes. You could pretty much go up to anyone in the gang and engage in dialogue with them, and it really makes the non-playable characters feel realistic. And the camp just pragmatically works well as like, okay, I finished a mission, I'm back at camp, I can save. Or, oh, I need to get some food, there's always a pot of stew going. Or, oh, I gotta replenish my ammo, there's the ammo thing. Or, oh, I went hunting and got a bunch of buck skins, I can sell them to this guy to make some crafting upgrades, right?
That, and you are the main provider for the camp. If you don't bring food in, if you don't bring in trinkets that they can pawn, then the gang is going under.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you develop this sort of responsibility for the rest of the people.
One of my favorite characters, Charles. Tell us who Charles is.
Charles is a half black, half Native American, very mysterious, wise. He teaches Arthur how to track animals early in the game. It is sort of this brooding character caught between worlds, not accepted, fully by either of the races of his parents, not accepted in conventional civilization,
Right.
and also sort of keeps an arm's distance somewhat from the gang, except from Arthur, who he regards pretty closely.
Outside of Arthur, probably the most capable member of the gang, and it's like if you had to play as one of these guys besides Arthur, you'd probably want to play as Charles. He's just an awesome character. There's now Mr. Pearson and Miss Grimshaw, or as Dutch says every time they start a new camp, Mr. Pearson, Miss Grimshaw. Work your magic. When tell the audience what the magic Mr. Pearson and Miss Grimshaw work.
Basically, just resetting up camp every time that they move. Every time the Pinkertons or some other rival gang figures out where they go, they have to go somewhere else. And this is what distinguishes the Dutch Vanderlyn gang from the other gangs: is that they create some semblance of civilization in their setups. They have food. They
Mr. Pearson's the cook, and Miss Grimshaw is sort of I don't know,
taskmaster. Just kind of keeps everyone in line. She also sort of has the other women in the camp who occupy this sort of intermediate role. They're sort of like con artists. I don't think that you would necessarily call them saloon gals or ladies of the night, but perhaps they would play that character to trick a guy and then rob him, is sort of the feel that they give off.
They all earn their keep. Every member of the gang has to provide. All right, last character I want to talk about, Sadie. Who is Sadie? That is someone they discover very early in the game.
Yeah,
right?
and you think Sadie is this her husband is murdered by these bad outlaws that you dispatch early in the game, and she joins the gang as sort of this merciful thing, and you're like, oh, she's fragile, or like she's going to be melancholy or sad the whole game. And then it turns out that, she puts on a pair of pants and starts holding a revolver, and it's like, wow, this lady, she's really got it going on. She leads the gang for a period of time when Arthur and the sort of other leaders of the gang are cut off from them, and she's just a really cool, like, powerful character. There was talk originally of her being sort of Arthur's love interest, but even though there's clearly a familiarity and respect between them, it never kind of reaches that point, and she's seen as this independent character.
Arthur has this sort of estranged love, Mary, who pops back in and out of the game occasionally, sort of the typical kind of gangster movie, outlaw movie trope where she's trying to get him to leave the life and run away with her, and he's just in too deep, and what would I do, and I need money, and there's sort of this heartbreaking element to Arthur's love life in that, but it's very fascinating as the game goes, because it starts out and you're basically, you talk about the geographical diversity of the game. You're sort of in these snowbound mountains, and you're immediately on the run, which is really cool. As we'll talk about some of the influences later, but it's very similar to the Hateful Eight, how that game sort of begins in the middle of what is essentially a snowstorm. And you kind of, as the game progresses, you think Dutch is this great leader, but you've learned in this mission in which, you did right before the events of the game, there's basically this botched ferry job where you were robbing a ferry, and Dutch
As in a boat.
Right, right. Uh-oh. And Dutch kills an innocent woman, right? And basically, as the game goes on, he kills more and more innocent people. And like you say, Dutch is starting to lose his fastball, right? There's these poorly planned jobs, these hasty decisions, these impulsive killings. And Arthur, your progression through the game, Arthur is just sort of growing disillusioned with all this.
He's also maturing into himself. I mean, because he looked at Dutch as this father figure, and as the game goes along, Arthur is sort of looking not only at the present, but at the past and thinking, were we ever actually like these good outlaws? Were we ever actually good guys? I mean, basically the way they make all of their money is by murdering people who are tasked with protecting money. And then they rob that money and then they run away. I mean, there's barely a mission that goes by without a tremendous amount of bloodletting. And I think that Arthur eventually starts to feel sort of like, boy, I really am just a guy who kills. And I think, too, it's such an interesting perspective for a video game character to have, because you kind of get to eat your cake and have it, too, in that when you're playing as this badass cowboy, you do want to be like, yeah, I'm taking on all these bad guys, pow, pow, pow. But how would a guy feel about doing all of the things that Arthur does? And I think that's this really interesting, self-aware perspective that they put on the character.
Quick break. We'll be right back. All right, I want to talk about some of the Western influences that influence Red Dead Redemption 2. So Red Dead Redemption 2 pretty shamelessly borrows from basically every classic Western, but especially the modern ones. This was right after, when the game came out, 2018, this was right after Tarantino had made Django Unchained and Hateful Eight. So there's so much taken from both of those. And just other ones I've jotted down as we've kind of been playing through the game recently. There Will Be Blood. True Detective. There's season 1 of True Detective. There's those morbidly obese, incestuous brother and sister evil characters. Those are basically whole cloth in this game. Once Upon a Time in the West, sort of the railroad tycoon character. There's this character named Leviticus Cornwall. There's sort of this oil and railroad tycoon. They kind of combine him with Daniel Plainview, and he's a really wonderful antagonist. And then with all the train robberies, it owes a big check to the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. And, it's something true about video games, too, where you can kind of steal from these things and do these pastiches and not have to be too artful about it, and people are kind of cool with it.
I think, too, what it gets away with is it doesn't necessarily take, I would say, plot points as much as it takes sort of the visual imagery, the cues of that. I mean, there's a really cool scene in the assassination of Jesse James, the Robert Ford, where there's this train that emerges from the darkness, and that is something that shows up also in the game. And it's just like, well, that's the coolest way to possibly show this happening. Why would we improve on it? Let's just take it.
And you imagine the game developers and designers were watching a lot of these movies to get into the mood for how to design the game. And it's like, well, may as well just, we have hours and hours and hours to design, and it's like, may as well crib here and there. Another interesting influence is the Hatfields and McCoys and that sort of feud we talked about. There's this sort of post-Civil War feud between these two families, the Grays and the Braithwaites. One is very, very wealthy, old South, almost like Gone with the Wind style characters, and then the other are kind of this like, poor white trash stereotype, right, who are kind of feuding with them, and that's a very interesting part of the game as well. But yeah, another thing I love about Red Dead is the score. The music in the game is so great. There's definitely a lot borrowed from Ennio Morricone, who did all the Sergio Leone westerns and some of the Tarantino westerns. But it's a very kind of sparse musical score, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it really is the sound effects of either the nature that you're in, birds chirping, wind rustling, animals making cries, or the town that you're in, clop, 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 people shouting out, ding, 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 stuff like that, where it really gives you this deep feel for the game. And then it also lends it the cinematic nature, because there are certain segments of the game where there are turning points or forks in the road in Arthur's life, and they'll just whip out a really brilliant song in there. I mean, like there's one by Willie Nelson, I think, at a pretty critical point. And you do get to experience this game in a different level. In addition to, there is this cinematic mode, which, has some mixed results, but there are times where you don't have to have that sort of bird's eye view of the character. They'll give you some sort of interesting angles to see Arthur from, and just let you experience and sort of sit back a little bit if you want to.
To kind of respond to our title of this episode and why we think Red Dead Redemption 2 is the greatest Western, I think really what it comes down to is just the expansiveness of the game. Not only in terms of the different cultures it captures, the different types of people, and sort of this time period, but also the breadth of its influences from the Western genre, and then just the unlimited possibilities you have as a player.
Yeah, you can do anything, really, in the game. You can hunt, you can fish. We've talked about all of this different stuff, and you get to decide, you can take as much time away from the gang as you want. You can build in Arthur thinking about what he's done with the gang. I need to go off and hunt for a while, or I need to go off and fish for a while, or I need to go help some people after all of the bad things.
Or
that I've done.
I'm really upset. I got to put on a bandit mask and rob a homestead. Yeah, I know what you mean.
And I think that, though, is the essence of the West. What everybody loves about the West and why we gravitate towards it and why the pioneers, went on that Oregon Trail is because there are those endless possibilities. And I think that is the promise of this landscape, and it's never more fully realized in any work of art than this video game.
I think, too, what makes the game so great is these revisionist elements that are sort of absent from the first one, where we're taking more perspectives. It is historical fiction, like there's a lot of truthfulness to the time period and how things are portrayed, but there's also just more voices to marginalized communities. The game feels very much like a classic Western, but it has a very modern approach to it, which, as guys who have written a Western and are trying to develop it right in this crazy town, we understand like the importance of a lot of modern Westerns are pretty slow and plodding and languid in pace, and a lot of the classic Westerns are a lot of fun, but there's some kind of modern audiences would say cancelable or just dated elements to them. And if you can kind of bridge the two, like Red Dead Redemption 2 does so well, it's just a perfect synthesis of the genre.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, too, it gives a more true feeling to the characters, that you see them as all fully fleshed out. For instance, there's a plot line with a Native American chief and his son, and the Native American chief has been through many wars and broken treaties and is just trying to secure a limited peace. Like, it's truly reduced from the height of his power. And the son, who hasn't been through these heartbreaking things, still wants to fight, still wants to get revenge. And I think it really captures sort of both sides of it well, and really expands on the humanity of being caught in this impossible situation in a way that the first Red Dead Redemption game didn't have any interest in doing, and most Westerns didn't really ever have any interest in doing.
The thing where the second game picks up on the first game is this notion of government oversight and government reach, with not only the Pinkertons, but also like Leviticus Cornwall, this oil and railroad tycoon, and just the old ways of tribes living in nature is ending, and the new way of settlers living in cities is coming in. And the gang relates to sort of these Native American struggles. I mean, as you said, they themselves are a tribe. So there is this interesting, clash between settlements and sort of freedom, right? And, there are obviously downsides to freedom as well, as we still see with the fallibility of so many characters in the gang. There's also like some interesting things about like immigrants and all the immigrants who came to California in particular, but just the West, around the gold rush and came to America with those dreams at that time. There's this great antagonist named Angelo Bronte, who, you could argue is a bit of an Italian stereotype, but he's kind of double crosses the gang, and he gets his comeuppance by getting kidnapped and fed to an alligator. But spoiler alert, but he's a great character because it's like, he's a guy who came from Italy and becomes like the top criminal mastermind of Saint Denis, right?
And
it's
looks down on the gang as
Right,
uncivilized. He's like, I run a city. I organize all of these different things. I have all of these people in my employ. You're just this little bumpkin. And I
Right.
think, too, it really does illustrate the variety of people that you see in this game and the variety of perspectives.
Well, while we're doing spoilers, let's go ahead and kind of wrap up and tell folks who have not played Red Dead Redemption 2 how it ends. So there's this massive turning point in Red Dead Redemption 2, a little over halfway through, where Arthur throughout the game has been coughing a lot. You notice that as you're playing. Even the first time, you're just like, boy, my character's coughing a lot. And he eventually collapses on a horse and is taken into a doctor in Saint Denis who informs him that he has tuberculosis. And you can kind of think back in the game, there's a very distinct moment, especially if you played a second time and you can see it. There's a distinct moment where Arthur is sort of against his will having to collect a debt from someone. You know, there's someone in the gang who gives crappy debts to people who can't pay him back, and Arthur goes and muscles his way into collecting them, and he's collecting it from this guy, and this guy, I think Arthur punches him, and the guy like coughs blood onto Arthur's face. And
Yeah, right on his face.
Clearly how he gets tuberculosis.
Yeah, the
right?
guy's tuberculotic, and you meet the guy earlier in the game. He's raising money for charity. He stops a fight. He stops Arthur from killing a man in a bar fight.
Right.
And I think that it is this, again, conscience of the game that you did something cruel to this good man, and now there are bad things that you have to pay as a result of it.
And it's just kind of ironic, you got Arthur Morgan's the baddest man in the West, and this disease is what kills him. And it's almost anticlimactic in kind of a cool way. And, you know, by the end, Arthur and Marston have always kind of butted heads, you see throughout the game. Arthur believes Marston to be, you know, even more impulsive than he. He resents Marston because for a brief time, Marston left the gang and then finally came back, and Arthur finds him a little disloyal. But basically, toward the end of the game, Arthur is realizing Dutch has lost his fastball, and Micah's kind of the main voice he's listening to. So Arthur helps John Marston escape with his family, you know, Abigail, Jack, Uncle, who we obviously see at the beginning of Red Dead 1. And it's essentially Arthur who goes and sacrifices himself for Marston, and he confronts Micah. And depending on if you have a good honor rating or a bad honor rating, there's sort of two ways the climax plays out. If you've been bad, you essentially, Micah will stab you in the back and you'll die a very violent death. However, if you've been good, you get a very nice death.
Yeah, you get away, you help Marston be free. I think Arthur sort of has this resentfulness of John, not just because he left, but because he left a family, which is something that Arthur never really had. And I think the tuberculosis diagnosis is good as well, because Arthur is this tragic hero. He's caught in this impossible situation as a result of his loyalty. But at the end, as you said, if you've acted honorably, you get this picturesque, beautiful death. You've succumbed to wounds and your disease. He's just really hanging on by his fingernails at the end, and he sits down on the top of a mountain, and this beautiful vista, one of the most beautiful that they have in the entire world, is right in front of him, and the sun's going down, and Arthur Morgan peacefully expires.
And while you play as Marston's son Jack in the epilogue of the first Red Dead, you play as Marston himself in the epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2, and you sort of see how John Marston begins to build his life on the ranch. And it's this very peaceful, almost coda to the end of the game. After all this violence and bloodshed, you're kind of back to like doing chores and like working as a farmhand. And it is funny. It is sort of the game steeps you in the pastoral dream and this kind of agrarian lifestyle. And I think if you're someone who's in an apartment in the middle of a city, you can play it and be like, oh, I really appreciate the country.
It's one of the great handoffs of any game or film or anything where your main character dies.
Yeah.
You're just like in the first one, and again the legacy is picked up, and there is just this like really nostalgic feel when you're back controlling Marston, and yet the game is even more clearer, more beautiful. You see the ranch that you know well from 10 years ago, and I think that there's just a deep emotionality that you've come to really respect this character of Arthur, and John does too. I mean, he really seems to look up to him, and it's like the Tom Hanks at the end of Saving Private Ryan to Matt Damon, earn this, and you know, Marston is really trying to earn it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're going to talk about some other epic westerns after the break. All right, we're going to discuss some other epic westerns that we can compare to Red Dead Redemption 2. But of course, Red Dead Redemption 2 stands above these. But they are worth mentioning.
I think we would say the reason it, just to put a final button on that, is the reason it stands above is you just get every single element of every Western. I would say that there are elements in these Westerns that we are going to discuss that have individually maybe more brilliant moments,
Yes.
and overall as an artistic thing, you could say, well, perhaps this is more worthy, but the
Right.
the achievement that is Red Dead Redemption 2 is why we put it up.
Yes,
number one.
exactly. The breadth, the expansiveness, etc. So let's talk about first Larry McMurtry, who's a famous Western writer. His massive book Lonesome Dove, which was eventually made into a miniseries in 1989, starring Tommy Lee Jones and Robert Duvall. By the way, that miniseries is streaming on Canopy. For those who don't know, we love Canopy. Canopy is a free streaming service you can get as long as you have a library card. You basically just punch in your library card information, and it's got a awesome library. I just watched There Will Be Blood on it. It's got a lot of great like classic Criterion Collection films, as well as just stuff you won't find on other streaming sites. And it's all free. You get something like 30 quote unquote tickets a month, and then each movie costs like 1 or 2 tickets. And you're never going to go through that many movies in a month, especially with all the other streaming options. But yeah, shout out Canopy. We love you.
Yeah, check it out. You feel smarter after being on
Yes,
Canopy.
yes,
It's like
yes.
reading a book, watching
Yeah,
something
I'm
on
using
Canopy.
my library card. It's just like reading. But anyway, so you've read the Lonesome Dove book, and you were a fan of McMurtry's style. Tell us a little bit just what you enjoy about the book.
He's the king of the genre. He really crafts this beautiful story centered around these two men. They're ranchers. We're kind of at the kind of end of their career. They're sort of just bumming around this very dusty, rundown ranch. There's a saloon in town where one of the guys goes in and he, tries to woo the lady there, and the other guy's a very sort of Spartan character. So you have this really hard-nosed, we're all about business and the cattle.
That's Tommy Lee Jones.
Tommy Lee Jones,
yes.
and then you have Robert Duvall's character, who's this sort of, good time Charlie, but also both of them are these ex-Texas Rangers who really know their stuff and are as bad as any men with a gun in their hands.
And when Duvall goes to the saloon/brothel, he always refers to the trysts with the ladies in there as going for a poke. That is how he refers to coitus, to sexual intercourse. He calls it a poke, which I think is kind of perhaps a juvenile way of describing a very intimate experience to be, reserved for engaging with someone you love. But it is a pretty hilarious way of saying it. I've only ever heard it in Lonesome Dove. But
it's full of really lived-in slang, and you just really are with these characters. And basically, the idea that they come up with is there's Gus McCrae, who is Duvall's character, and Woodrow Call, who is Tommy Lee Jones's character. They get this crazy idea to drive cattle from Texas to Montana because they've heard there's good land,
Right.
good grazing land in Montana that they can have. They bring along a sort of lovable gang of cast-offs. There's sort of a dandy, unreliable character. There's a Mexican chef who refuses to ride his mule because he thinks it's cruel to the mule. And there's just a lot of like humor and humanity in this genre that I think often deals in caricature or
Yeah.
overly stoic characters, sort of represented by the like Clint Eastwood archetype.
Yeah, but it's a fabulous miniseries. I think it's about 4 episodes, and each episode's about an hour and a half. And if you get a chance, really check it out. When it came out in 1989, it aired on CBS, and there really were no westerns of note in the 70s and 80s. And this miniseries, along with 1992's Unforgiven, directed by and starring Clint Eastwood, kind of saved and revived the western genre.
Yeah, it was westerns were sort of looked at as part and parcel with Elvis,
Right.
And it's
Yeah,
like, this is the
dated,
old
yeah.
fusty thing that my parents are into,
Right.
and this sort of revived it and showed, this can have modern sensibilities, this can appeal to a new audience.
But some of those, moving on, some of those last westerns before they fell out of fashion were made by Sergio Leone, and we'll discuss his oeuvre a little bit here. He, of course, had the Man with No Name trilogy. He sort of popularized the spaghetti western. So that stars Clint Eastwood. So those 3 films, A Fistful of Dollars for a few dollars more, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. A trilogy that really gets better with each movie, just gets bigger and better. Sort of like going from Red Dead 1 to Red Dead 2. I'm sure Sergio Leone would be rolling over in his grave if he heard me comparing his oeuvre to Red Dead, but I'll maybe think about it kind of favorably. But yeah, each movie just kind of gets bigger and badder, and those movies are really wonderful. But I would say perhaps my favorite of his movies is Once Upon a Time in the West, which came out a little later, I think might have been late 60s, and that has Charles Bronson and in pretty much his only ever villainous role, Henry Fonda, who I believe was, the film version of Grapes of Wrath, and, always kind of played these good guys, and he in this movie is really terrible and just an absolute villain. And it's a really, really great epic Western. There's a lot that Red Dead 2 takes from Once Upon a Time in the West. And I think of all the Sergio Leone spaghetti Westerns, it might be my favorite.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think the star that you think of most when you think of Sergio Leone is Clint Eastwood. And there is something so interesting about, because the style, the way they shot spaghetti westerns is they would shoot all of the footage without sound,
right,
and then they dub it afterwards. I think it makes it leads Eastwood to make these really interesting choices as a character where he barely moves his mouth, which I think makes it easier to do the dubbing afterwards. But he himself, I mean, I think we think of Eastwood now as the 90-year-old man who makes these very serious sort of historical fiction movies about American, which are all in very grayscale cinematography. But he was a capital M, capital S movie star.
Absolutely,
like just true presence on the screen.
You can quibble with him as an actor and it's sort of technically, but
perhaps his political beliefs.
sure, talking to an empty chair, etc. But as a screen presence, many as good, hard to name any better, right?
Absolutely.
Speaking of oeuvres, I want to discuss John Wayne's oeuvre as well. John Wayne has a few westerns that are, have some cancelable characters and such, but a couple that I think really stand the test of time. One is The Searchers. That is a really incredible film. Again, some elements of it that are dated and you wouldn't get away with today, but his performance, the cinematography, I'm spacing on the director. I want to say it's John Huston. Maybe I'll have my brother fact check that for me. Oh, Will's going to. It's a race. Who's going to get it? Who directed it? John Huston?
John Ford.
Sorry, John Ford. And then Rio Bravo is another great John Wayne film where he's with Dean Martin and kind of a hangout movie. Very, very slowly paced. You're kind of just hanging out with John Wayne and boozy Dean Martin. And then I forget the name of the young guy. It was supposed to be played by Elvis. I think Ricky isn't. It's not Ricky Martin. Ricky Nelson, maybe. Let me look it up really quick. Ricky Nelson, I think. Yeah, Ricky Nelson. Those two John Wayne movies, some have not aged super well, but The Searchers, Rio Bravo, really, really great.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of got to see it in sort of the time period in which it took place. But again, John Wayne, I think, is, again, another person who is known for probably the imitations done of him, like, hey there, Pilgrim, and stuff like that. And it really, really fails to capture just how in command he is in every scene. He's the manliest man in every scene and is also as gentle as a dove to any of the ladies that come in the screen. And there's this Joan Didion piece about him where she loved watching him growing up, which I think is like a interesting thing. You would not think of Joan Didion as being a John Wayne fan, and I think there's really no other way to say it. He exudes, and I believe this is how she phrased it, sexual prowess.
Yes.
You're just like, this is the only guy who knows what he's doing in this sort of situation. He just has this like great like presence, and when you see him on screen, much in the same way with Clint Eastwood, you see John Wayne on screen, you're like, they don't make actors like this anymore.
Yes,
he's
100%.
got all there, no facelifts, never used skincare in his life. This is a guy who
a steak every night, I'm sure. Yeah.
His name was Marion. He was a Hollywood actor, but boy, he was good at pretending how to be a real man.
100%. Randolph Scott is an actor I want to talk about. Not a lot of people know Randolph Scott. He was the star of many Westerns, particularly those in the Renown cycle, which was directed by Bud Buddicker back, I believe, in the 50s. And they involved 5 Westerns named Ride Lonesome, The Tall T, Decision at Sundown, Buchanan Rides Alone, and Comanche Station. We've seen a couple of these films, and they're all about 90 minutes or less. And it's just basically very simple plots. And Randolph Scott, who's one of the most handsome actors to ever live, he was known for I guess you'd call it sexually ambiguous friendship with Cary Grant, another famous leading man of the day. They were roommates for well over a decade, I believe. And this was a time,
very fond and affectionate roommates.
This was a time where you had to be a little more discreet about these things. But those are also wonderful, wonderful films. And then going back to literature for a second, I want to talk about Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. I think certainly this will be a book that the Flynn Brothers Book Club will tackle on a future episode. But we would be remiss if we talked about epic westerns and did not mention Blood Meridian. Again, we'll go into it in more detail on a future episode, but it's essentially considered one of the great American novels. It essentially deals with America's genocidal past involving white settlers, Mexicans, and the Native Americans. And the main critique levied against the book is it's insanely violent, and you and I have a pretty high tolerance for violence, and even we were kind of grossed out at a lot of the, Cormac McCarthy, brilliant writer, but it is a tough book to read.
Yeah, there are sections of poetic beauty mixed with gruesome descriptions of the violence perpetrated on all sides. It's I think now that the West has been won, quote unquote, and sort of the America took the land from Mexicans and Native Americans, we see kind of a different version of it. In this era, it's very much up for grabs. It's not clear who is going to win this battle. And I think you really get to see the fierceness of the warriors that were trying to protect what was theirs and what they had fought and won. And then you also see how perilous it was to just be out in this totally lawless land. But, it has a feeling akin to Moby Dick. Like, it's written in this way that no other book has really ever been written. It dives into just like slang and really anachronistic dialogue while also, discussing the nature of existence and reality. And it's just a humongous book that in every sense of the word, it just lands like an anvil on your head when you're finished reading.
But yeah, I think, coming back to Red Dead Redemption 2, as great as all these works are, we've hit it before. It's just the breadth, the expansiveness of Red Dead 2. It encapsulates all these works and others. And that is why it is the best Western. Greatest Western. We're still holding out for that sponsorship. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to pitch our best ideas for a Red Dead Redemption 3. All right, Pitch Jim and Pitch John coming at you. We last time we were here on the podcast, we were pitching a Moby Dick adaptation. Today, we're doing Red Dead Redemption 3, and it's pretty interesting because Red Dead Redemption 2 was a prequel to Red Dead Redemption 1, so kind of where I want to start, and we'll just sort of pitch ideas loosely back and forth, Pitch Jim and Pitch John style, is if you were to do a third one, do you think you would go the prequel route, or do you think you would go the sequel route?
Well, I have ideas on both.
Oh, curious. Well, why don't we start with, since Red Dead 2 was a prequel, why don't we start with sequel? If you were to do kind of a sequel to these two stories, where would you go with a sequel, you think?
Well, I was thinking, of course, you hand off the game to Jack Marston.
Right. This is around kind of the late 19 teens, 1920s, yes. Right? Yeah.
And I was, what is in this time period? What could be interesting in this era? And I'm also thinking, Rockstar Games and their sort of proclivities and the idea of prohibition came up to me.
Yes, I had the exact same thing written down, almost a boardwalk empire approach to this. Yeah, I think, Red Dead Redemption 2 does this great thing with the contrast of country versus city, with these country folk and, the city folk in Saint Denis. And I think you could really tap into something like that, because gangsters are essentially an evolution of outlaws, right, from the Old West. Gangsters have always existed, but in terms of our American perspective, that is sort of the evolution of them. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting approach.
I think it would bridge the gap between Red Dead Redemption 2 and LA Noire. You'd be operating sort of in the 20s. I don't believe we've gotten a Chicago-esque city from
any of the GTAs
the
or
GTA,
any. Yeah,
anything
I don't know if
Rockstar
they've
has
done
done.
Chicago.
You could have
yeah.
the snow. You could have a huge lake, whatever. And then I also think you would have these excursions to Cuba, sort of this, which is where the Americans went to play during Prohibition, and could kind of let people explore that area. It's not a country that you're really easily able to visit as an American.
The great thing about Chicago in the 20s too is you can continue the great Red Dead Redemption pattern of stereotyping Irish people. That would be,
plenty of
they
Irish.
could stay true to that. That'd be cool.
Absolutely. So, and I think too, it's like you could still have the sort of country element with the moonshiners and the city element, which really is what makes the games, I think, shine.
So you're kind of a moonshiner would be kind of interesting.
Maybe you're kind of a go-between. Where do we take it from Jack Marston's point of view?
That's interesting.
Like, do we continue it with this character? Maybe he starts out as a moonshiner, smuggler. He gets into Chicago, gets under you get some Al Capone type characters.
Kind of works his way up.
Yeah, exactly.
Part of this, too, these great characters in these games have this dual personality, right? With Arthur, it's his good side and his bad side. You could have sort of this countryside and city side where it's like, I was raised in the country and I'm a country boy, but now there are all these temptations and thrills of the city life, and that's sort of the disconnect you're experiencing. I will say this, though, it would be weird seeing a car. And you do see him, I believe, in the first Red Dead game, but having a character drive a car would too much would be a little crazy, because so much of Red Dead is you're on that horse and you're feeling the clop. And we've talked on this podcast a lot of our to quote Ronald Reagan, there's something about the outside of a horse that's good for the inside of a man. That was something you said into this very microphone.
Right, but imagine the first time you're learning how to drive a car. you're leaning out the window to go rat-tat-tat. You'll never get me, coppers.
Tommy gun.
Yeah, there's still bank robberies. There's still train robberies. There's still all of the things that we love about the Red Dead Redemption 2 world. But it's got a little citified element to it.
I think if you do a sequel, that's pretty much the furthest you could go. I don't think you could go into modern day or really past that sort of Prohibition time period you're talking about. So why don't we move to perhaps a more prequel approach to this? So this would be going even before Red Dead 2, right? We've had Red Dead 1, which is 1911, and then Red Dead 2 kind of is 1899 up into that 1911. So this would have to be sort of pre-1899, unless, do you have a prequel that's in between, or what do you got? What are your ideas
I've
for
got
a prequel?
much, much, much earlier than 1899.
Much. Admit, is this still in the 1800s?
No.
Oh, my goodness. Let's hear it.
It's far further back than that. I would put it more around, I guess, 9000 BC. I'm
They
thinking
had cowboys back then?
No. We're crossing the Eurasian land bridge.
Oh,
you
my
are
goodness.
like,
is this horses coming back to America? Are you doing this again?
No, it isn't. It's humans. It's the
humans,
first
okay.
Americans. The very first Americans.
Wow.
You're crossing the Eurasian land bridge. You're coming down through Canada. You're gonna have to truncate the size of the map. The way that they do it. And you're sort of. I was inspired by the kind of tribe element of the game of Red Dead. Now look. They're not going to speak English, so you're going to have to sort of, give a little conceit to that. They wouldn't have spoke English at that time, but you make it more be focused on hunting and tracking, and perhaps there are some rival tribes that you get into some conflicts with.
This is very similar to a game that goes even way further back. We played very, very boring game, but we enjoyed, called Ancestors, where you were an early primate, kind of pre-human evolution.
We're full Homo sapiens.
No, I got that. that, but it kind of reminds me because the gameplay of that game is, you're essentially like swinging through the trees, discovering, you have to like kind of use your senses to smell. Is this fruit good? Is this fruit going to kill me? And there's so much like experimentation involved, but this is a little more evolved version of that, which I find very, very interesting. That's really going back in time.
Part of, we said, the appeal of Red Dead Redemption 2 is the unspoilt nature of the West, and it's never more unspoilt than...
That's unspoiled for sure. When I was thinking prequel, I was thinking, I'm going to stick in the 1800s if you'll allow it. I was thinking Gold Rush.
Ooh.
I was thinking you're kind of a miner who goes to California to strike it rich in the Gold Rush. And, of course, like many of the miners who went to California for the gold rush, you end up unsuccessful and you're desperate and you kind of join a gang. And it's a more kind of California-focused approach to Red Dead Redemption I found very interesting. Other sort of, I'll just kind of rapid fire you a bit, too, here, if you don't mind. I was thinking, there was the famous Oregon Trail game.
Right.
You could kind of do an Oregon Trail approach to it as well. One thing I really loved from another Rockstar game was in Grand Theft Auto 5, they did this brilliant approach where they had 3 protagonists with interweaving stories. It was basically this retired Italian crime boss, this young black guy who's kind of working his way up in the mob, and then you have the mob boss's old friend who's kind of moved to essentially the desert and is kind of a meth head. And you have these 3 sort of interweaving characters, and I think that would be a really cool approach to Red Dead 3, where it's like, okay, you take the perspective of someone in a Native American tribe, you take the perspective of maybe like a white gold miner, and then maybe you take the perspective of like someone who is like in the
madam.
Yeah, a madam. Yeah, you could do a female character because GTA 6 they have a female protagonist, and you could do a madam or like someone like a Mexican soldier who's like gotten out of the army after the Mexican-American War, something like that. Because you could kind of the West at that time, it was mostly white, it was mostly Native American, it was mostly Mexican. So to kind of have those 3 perspectives interweaving, I think would be very, very interesting.
Yeah, I like that. If we were to tie it a little bit more to Red Dead Redemption, I could see I think this runs the risk of being a solo type project, as in the Han Solo origin story, where you distilled the mysteries surrounding his origins, and that sort of ruined, in retrospect, the character. But you could see, younger Arthur, Dutch, and Hosea as 3, and it's talking about the 3 perspectives. You see those 3 guys running around. Hosea a little bit more in command of his faculties. Dutch not quite as megalomaniac, and Arthur is a real wild young boy running wild in the early West.
I like that, I like that.
You could tie some stuff there.
So we pretty much got everything covered from 9,000 BC up to the 1920s. Did you have any other pitches in your back pocket here? The well's pretty tapped for me. Are you tapped?
I'm tapped. I mean,
You're tapped,
I gave you 9,000 BC.
Oh, no, it's
I
good.
said the words
you
crossing the Eurasian land bridge.
Me in a pitch gym, he pushes, right? He tries to get as many ideas up on the whiteboard as possible. But I think clearly the well is tapped, and that's a good place to call it. So please subscribe, comment, and leave a rating. Send questions, comments, or big idea suggestions to our business email, flynnbrospod@gmail.com. Thank you to our producer, Will Slade, and we'll see you next time on the Flynn Brothers Podcast. Take care, buddy.
Hey, buddy. You take care.